we've been working with the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit in really organising this session, which was to brief you as MPs and peers on the next step in the UK's climate leadership, obviously in the run-up to COP26, which is the publication of an updated nationally determined contribution, and how this is going to work, what this means, what this looks like, and in particular, this is really the first step in what we hope to be a series of events, and hopefully in the not too distant future, you know, we'll do these in person as well, of course, is a series of events to engage parliamentarians working with Alok and the Cabinet Office and his team from a government perspective, and working with parliamentarians and outside groups and outside stakeholders, try and bring together and watch and help develop UK's diplomatic position in the run-up to COP26, and how we're doing and how we can do it better and what we're aiming for as well. So all of this is the first step in that process. I would like to introduce Alison Doig, who is the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit COP specialist. And, you know, Alison, thank you. It's a real pleasure to get you, and you will become even more in demand as the weeks and months go on. And I'm just going to, we're going to start with you, and then we'll move on to Lord Deben, who many of you will know, Chairman of the Committee on Climate Change, to give his view on where we are and how we go forward. And also Amber Rudd, who many of you will know, who will then give her perspective on the UK's position in climate leadership, particularly because she led, I think she led the British delegation in 2015 climate summit in Paris. So there we are. Alison, over to you. Amber, very good to see you.
Hello, Bim. Sorry to be a few minutes late.
No, it's not at all. And I was just introducing you and saying that, you know, you can tell us what dealing with all these world leaders is like from the UK's perspective in relation to climate leadership. And so we're going to hear from Alison first, then Lord Deben, and then Amber.
Can I just let Dom know that I was going to share my screen, but I've been blocked from sharing my screen. I wonder if that can be corrected.
Ooh.
I'll do that now.
Yeah. Okay. So I believe I'm going to do a sort of very factual over on what is COP and what can we expect in the coming year. It's still disabled, but I'll continue regardless. Dom, if you can let me know when I can share my lovely pictures. So because of COVID, COP's been been postponed by 1 year. We're hoping next year it will be a full and vibrant event in Glasgow. But I wanted just to talk about a little bit about, well, what exactly is a COP? What can we expect, and what will happen in the run-up to COP? So very factual around that, and then we'll get into the really interesting political conversations, I'm sure, later on. So it all started back in 1992 at the Earth Summit. The Earth Summit was the birthplace for the UN Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, who hosts the COP with the president. It was also the birthplace of the Convention on Biodiversity. So I can now share my screens, which I'll do now, which I hope will be useful. That's the wrong thing. So, apologise. Unfortunately, it's really not working today.
We can see your screen how we got the Paris Agreement.
Oh, can you? Yes, you can see that. Oh, good. Sorry, that's not what's coming up on my screen. That's brilliant. I'll just continue then. So we started with the Earth Summit, and that spawned the UNFCCC, and then also the Convention on Biodiversity, which also has a major COP next year in China. So the first COP, and COP is Conference of the Parties to the UN Convention on Climate Change, and that first one was in '95. It was then decided to implement that through protocols and agreements, and the first was the Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto put in commitments to wealthy countries to cut emissions only. So it was only a wealthy country commitment at that stage. But as it ran out and it ran its course, we decided we needed a replacement. We tried in Copenhagen, the conference of the party tried in Copenhagen to come up with that replacement and failed. But 6 years later, as you can see from the picture, happy excitement as the Paris Agreement, quite a substantial agreement, was put in place. And the COP26 in Glasgow is all about implementing. How do we deliver that now that the Paris Agreement is come into force? How is it different? Well, in this time round of the Paris Agreement, all 195 or so countries take commitments. Every single country involved does. And what we committed to was keeping global warming below 2 degrees and pursuing all efforts to keep below the much safer 1.5 degrees of warming. To do this, we need to mitigate, that is cut carbon. And it was decided that in Paris, this would be a bottom-up approach. Each country would offer its commitment, its nationally determined commitment. Unfortunately, when we added up the nationally determined commitments in Paris, they got not as towards 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, we were actually heading towards 3 degrees of warming, which was really unsafe and really unpredictable. We don't know what will happen in that degree of warming at all across the globe. So that's why in 2020, countries have been asked to come forward with enhanced commitments, enhanced NDCs. We'll hear more about that today. Paris also made commitments on adaptation, how you adapt to the impacts of climate change, on loss and damage. What do you do when climate disaster strikes? If you're a Pacific island and you're losing your land to the sea, how does the global community support you? And of course, there was a decision on funding, the 100 billion a year target. So on the way to Glasgow over the next year, there are a few key events. Very soon, in fact, next month, on the 12th of December, the UK with France is inviting the world to join its Climate Ambition Summit and put forward ambitious commitments on that day. In the run-up to COP, the UNFCCC has pre-meetings. These are for the negotiators to really get ready so that things are ready to be presented at COP and be signed up and agreed ahead of COP. The UK is also hosting the G7 summit, so this is an opportunity for major economies to come forward and say what they're going to do on the way to deliver the Paris Agreement and really up their game. And we're co-hosting the COP with Italy, and Italy is going to hold, in particular, a youth summit in late September, which brings the youth voice into the full COP. We're expecting at that event next month, on the 12th of December, that the UK will come forward with its own first NDC out of the European Union. And the aim is to produce an enhanced and an increased emissions reduction target for 2030. And I think Lord Deben will talk more about that. What are other countries doing? We're not alone in this. In fact, the UK should really be playing a leadership role to make sure many, many more countries come forward with these enhanced commitments. 10 countries have already done so. There are about 90 other countries that have said they will also follow suit with an NDC by 2020. Most of these are developing countries or vulnerable countries. The vulnerable countries who are really vulnerable to climate change call this deadline of the end of the year for new NDCs their survival deadline. Is that critical to them? The EU is expected to come forward with its enhanced NDC in December or very soon after. We were slightly taken aback when China set its own net zero by 2060 pledge. It would go net zero emissions by 2060, and therefore raising expectations of a really substantially better NDC from China coming forward. Japan and South Korea have followed suit with their own net zero by 2050 target. And of course, quite devastatingly, today, the day after the US election, the US has actually formally left on this day the Paris Agreement. With Trump, obviously, that will be maintained and they will be isolated in that climate community largely. If Biden wins, he has pledged to come straight back in and do better. How do we deliver those targets? The COP presidency has said setting real-world initiatives in place in parallel with the commitments. So there are 5 real-world priorities. One's on adaptation, so a real focus on the vulnerable countries around the world. Another on nature, how do we safeguard nature and the climate and the planet together? Nature's raising up this agenda. Energy transition to lower zero carbon energy, zero carbon transport, and finance, that's city finance. How do we shift the trillions? So in a year's time, we'll be in Glasgow. This is the venue, the exhibition centre, Scottish Exhibition Centre. There'll be a green zone, a sort of activity outside of the main negotiations at the Science Centre in Glasgow. So who will be there? There'll be many, many countries, maybe a few heads of states. There will be the G77. A lot of the countries come together in blocks. The G77 is the developing countries. You've got the EU that act as one. The small island states, they have a voice of their own in that place. Who else will be there? Of course, you will have businesses, you have faith leaders, you will have civil society, all there, keeping an eye on the negotiations and calling for raised ambition in that space. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you very much for that. And it's a very good background to understand exactly what we're dealing with here. Lord Deben, over to you.
Right. Well, as you know, the Climate Change Committee was set up under the Climate Change Act, which was an all-party act. And it's always worth remembering just how broad was the consensus that put that act into place. It was proposed and written by the Conservative Party in opposition, got the support of the other opposition parties right across the board, from the Protestant Unionists to the Scottish Nationalists and the Liberal Democrats and the whole lot, and then approached the government, the Labour government at the time, and said, we've got this, we want it to be an all-party decision, and there are plenty of Labour members who will support it, so we want you to take it over. I think the biggest step that was taken was that it was not a party political thing, it was all party, and in the end it was passed with a very small number of people voting against it. I think some 8, one or 2 of whom are still around and still don't believe that climate change is happening. And as a result, we set up the Climate Change Committee, and it started off with a sort of shadow meeting, because the government asked it to decide what was the aim. In other words, how much did we have to reduce our emissions? And originally the plan was to reduce it by 60%. The Climate Change Committee, in its shadow position, said no, it's got to be 80. So we started off with an aim at reducing our emissions by 80% by the year 2050. And the Climate Change Committee was then had a series of duties and powers. Duties to deliver budgets by which the government would operate between then and 2050. It was rather sensibly done, because the budgets didn't start until quite a little time ahead. So it meant members of Parliament didn't have to think about how it was going to affect their constituency tomorrow afternoon. And it's surprising how much more independent and willing to look at the broad side thing, if I may say so, Bim, if you're not really wondering whether Mrs. Miggins is going to like it or not. So we, in a sense, that was the first very important bit of it. The second tremendously important bit of it was that we were a committee. I wasn't on it then, but it was a committee of experts. It was largely scientists with a few economists, and the idea of that was that it would not be a kind of representative group. It would genuinely be scientific advice, the best advice we could have, and the budgets would be presented to Parliament. Parliament would then decide upon them, and if Parliament accepted them, then they couldn't be changed without the Climate Change Committee agreeing that a change was necessary. And that was crucially important, because what you've got to do is to try to link together the two periods that you've got. You've got the democratic period of 4 or 5 years before somebody has to renew their mandate. And then you've got the climate change period, which is that you can't stop doing this. You've got to get on with it, because climate change isn't waiting. So you've got a much more difficult situation there. How do you bring those two together? And that was really what the Climate Change Act did. It gave parliamentary control on accepting the budget. It gave the government the job of deciding which of the various possibilities to achieve that budget they would do. And then it gave the Climate Change Committee the duty every year of saying whether it was on target or not, of suggesting new ways of doing it, and ultimately it gave the courts the permission to take the government to court if the government was not doing what was now statutorily necessary. So what we've got in Britain is a statutorily necessary target and a series of budgets. We've done the first 2 budgets. Third budget is well on the way. We'll meet that. There's the 4th and 5th budget. There are real questions over whether we're doing enough on those 2 budgets. Indeed, I can say very definitely that at the moment we're not doing enough, and this is what we've said to the government. The government's going to have to produce some much more detailed action in order to do that. And now, of course, we've got the final date, the 2050 date of net zero. At the end of this year, about the 9th of December, the Climate Change Committee will produce its 6th carbon budget, which will take us towards the end of the 2030s. And in a sense, it's the most important budget because by the time you get to the end of the 2030s, you can draw a straight line between that and 2050 to see exactly where you've got to be. So it's going to be a very crucial budget, and we're working on it now. Indeed, I have just received, literally before this, the draft of we've done each of the bits together, the draft of the final setup, which I'm now going to spend the rest of the week reading as a whole instead of in bits, because things do look different. And it is a very remarkable piece of work. I can say that it is perhaps the most remarkable piece of work we've done, certainly after the piece of work we did to show that we could do net zero by 2050, which was universally, I think, recognized as a very important document and is used widely by other countries, and is in a sense the basis upon which Britain will now press others to sign up to a greater effort to achieve the Paris commitments. So can I finish off by talking about that? It will be for the government to decide what its offer is. It will be no surprise to anybody that it's asked the Climate Change Committee to give some advice on that, and that advice we have prepared and given to the government, and it will be for the government to decide on that. Obviously, it's indicative already because we know where we have to be at various stages, including 2030 and 2035. We know where we have to be in order to meet our statutory requirement of net zero by 2050. So, you know, roughly speaking, where at least we have to get to. So the lowest that we can offer is the point at which we would have to be there. But of course, we'll be trying to encourage other people to do more. And it must be a huge encouragement to the government that China and South Korea and Japan, which together make a very, very major part of the international economy, have come up with what many thought very remarkable promises. Of course, people have got to fulfill their promises, and people are better at promising than delivering. That is a statement of all politicians and all governments, and certainly all British governments. And I've had to deal with 3 kinds, so I'm pretty clear as to where we are on that. Now, what the government will then have to do will be to encourage the recalcitrant and to ensure that people all improve what they've got down now, because actually it's not enough to keep global warming well below 2 degrees, and that is crucially important. I think that one of the most important things will be for the government to ensure that the money is available for the developing countries. There is a very clear moral statement. We rich countries cause climate change. We have grown rich because of climate change. The reason we are rich countries is the pollution that we have created. And Britain led that. I'm not ashamed of it because it's been a hugely remarkable, transformative thing from the historic situation 200 years ago to where we are now. But the Industrial Revolution came at a cost, and it is that cost we have to pay. So there isn't any issue about this. We've committed ourselves, as Alison said, to a very large sum of money. We're better at committing it than actually delivering it. And this government's going to have to make sure that the delivery takes place. So for me, there are 4 things that we as a committee will be insisting upon. First of all, the government must show that it is meeting its own obligations. Absolutely no point of arriving at Glasgow if it can't point very clearly to the fact that it has in train the measures which will result in meeting its own obligations. Secondly, the government must work very hard to ensure that all nations improve their offering. Thirdly, the government has a real responsibility to make sure that people pay the bill. And we have to take a lead in that. We have a very good reputation for this, and Amber Rudd was at the heart of that, and one has to congratulate her for achieving that as her key offering. And the 4th thing the government has got to do is the most difficult thing of all. It has got to explain to people in language which they understand what it is doing, why it is doing it, and why it alone is the route out of COVID, bringing together the 2 important issues, the existential issue of climate change and the economically vital issue of how we recover after COVID. Happily, the route is the same, but the language, the explanation, the ability to bring everyone in to what is a just transformation is the government's most difficult but central purpose over the next 12 and 13 months.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lord Deben. That was very, very interesting. Thank you for that. And I should have mentioned earlier, people do have questions, so we'll come to questions after Amber has made her remarks. So if people do have questions, pop them in the chat, and then we will try and we will come to them after Amber is finished. Amber Rudd, one of the Conservative Party's and Parliament's good eggs, who's unfortunately no longer with us on the Commons benches, but is doing all sorts of very interesting things. And I'm so glad, Amber, that you could join us. Over to you.
That's very sweet of you, Bim. I went very quickly from rising star to the exit door, I feel. But it's great to be here and listening to you and Lord Deben and Alison. And Alison, seeing your presentation almost made me nostalgic for 5 years ago in Paris, which we all approached with such excitement. And I'm going to just make some remarks about why I think Paris was a success and what that teaches us about what we can do to make sure that Glasgow is a success. First of all, the French did a fantastic job. The huge effort they had put into corralling everybody, getting them in the right place ahead of the actual agreement, and then during the intense 2 weeks that we were there. Huge amounts of pre-planning had gone into it, and mostly it was an effort done by the Foreign Office of France, the Quai d'Orsay. And Laurent Fabius led this, so you had a man of great international stature who was well respected, not just in France, but internationally. He put everything he had into it for the year before. And really, it was a most remarkable diplomatic effort. There is always a pre-COP, and as Alison set out for us, a kind of UNFCCC lead up to it with the biodiversity. But the French really took advantage to make sure that they got as much done ahead of the conference as possible. So, for instance, it was largely done with China. There were major issues to discuss and to look at over the 2 weeks we were in Paris, but a lot of it had been pre-agreed. But not everybody knew that. And the way the French handled it when we went into the 2-week sort of lockdown in Paris was exemplary, really. They would put out a very tough text for everybody to look at, which pleased one side, and then everybody would feed back and people would feel indignant about it. And then lo and behold, 2 days later, another text came out in which their concerns were reflected. I mean, it was a master, really, of managing people's expectations, making everybody feel they'd contributed, and making sure that when we got to the final day, there was the best chance possible of getting an agreement. And I think it's important to remember that it wasn't obvious at the time that we were going to get an agreement. The ghost of Copenhagen was present all the time in Paris. And by the way, when we say we were in Paris, we were actually quite far outside of Paris. People who had ideas of traveling into the Louvre for a quick tourist session were very much disappointed, because it was basically a conference center built outside Paris, and we were under pretty much a kind of COVID familiar lockdown. And the last few days, as we built up to when we were actually going to try and agree the final text, the last 2 days, the French basically switched off the food. They switched off the food. On the last day, they switched off the coffee. And you could see the whole enterprise being packed away under us. So it was that intense feeling of, oh my goodness, we've got to arrive at an agreement. It sounds trivial, but it kind of, I think, helped tip everybody over to actually feeling maybe they'd got enough out of this and we could agree it and go home. And of course, ultimately, that's what we did. We talked about, I heard earlier about COP and COP potentially having heads of state there. We had almost every head of state came to Paris. And again, that reflected the Parisian effort and the commitment they'd made. And really, the lead up to Paris made it such an important moment for all countries that everybody needed to participate one way or another. So we had all the heads of state turn up. There was one awkward moment when the priority from the UK delegation was to make sure that Robert Mugabe never actually crossed paths with Prince Charles. But apart from that, everything went smoothly, including the final photograph to show that everybody had been there. And David Cameron from our side was very committed to it. When he first appointed me as Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, he said, keep the bills down, harder than it turned out than he thought, and get me a deal in Paris. It was absolutely a priority. And I just reflect on that it was, for everybody participating, I think, a moment when their population expected them to show commitment, to get something for it. And as Lord Deben said, there was a very strong moral streak there where developed countries were expected to be contributing financially to underdeveloped countries to make sure that they weren't paying for the polluting that we had been doing. And that will run right through everything that is done internationally on climate change, and is reasonable, but is still tricky. So I think that when I look at what made Paris a success, one, it was the French, and the second was the Americans. And because I'm no longer in government, I can say very clearly that I am epically disappointed not to have a Biden president confirmed to take over in January today. Because having a president who is committed to the principles of addressing climate change and the principles of paying underdeveloped countries in order that they can develop without polluting, etc., makes a huge difference. And Obama had his man there, and his man was supported by John Kerry, who came for the final 2 days. And there is no question the American policy, American might, American money made a big difference to delivering a success in Paris. So I am worried that, as I'm sure most people on this call are as well, that without the Americans, it makes the success much harder. So looking ahead finally to Glasgow, the good news is we've had a year to get ready for it. The good news is that we've got the evidence of Paris. I think that the COP to Glasgow in the next year should be run from the Foreign Office, not the Business Department, because I was so impressed by the level of diplomacy, and I'm not sure that effort is going into it at the moment. And I remain concerned about the commitment from the US, which is a key ingredient to make any COP a success. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Amber. If I might just start by asking a couple of questions. Just first of all, back to you, Amber. You've mentioned the Americans and their importance. Putting aside exactly what happens with the presidential election, let's just work on the basis that America is not as committed as it was, either because Trump's there or because Biden's political position he doesn't feel is strong enough to put weight behind. But that is something as a British government you just have to live with. I mean, you can't change that. What's your assessment, therefore, of the Chinese, the European Union, and other players? And do you think that would that can make up for the lack of American engagement with that? And if it can't, without sounding too gloomy, do you think these talks are almost doomed to not be very successful? So effectively, how critical are the Americans for COP26 coming out?
I mean, I could make a good argument for pointing out that the American states have actually done a great job, many of them, in decarbonising despite Trump. So we mustn't give up on the Americans. They still do a good job in some states. But nothing compares to American leadership, money and policy and language than to actually have that on your side for a COP. How important is it? It's important. I'm not going to say it's doomed because we've been pleasantly surprised. I think Alison mentioned this as well, by China and Japan. But if the Americans came as well, that would make 73% of the world's emissions would be committed to reducing to net zero by 2050, which is huge. So the Americans coming in would, I think, almost guarantee success. Not having it makes it harder. And here's another thing. In terms of the wider geopolitical issues about the impact of climate change and the significance of energy to people's economies, whether they're developing or they are developed, we know the role of oil and gas and how important it is in combats in different countries and their economies, and it's quite often in their success and their growth as part of their own initiatives and their own development. Not having the Americans participate will hand leadership in a way potentially to the Chinese at a time when the West is concerned about China's hegemony. That does concern me as well. The EU have made some huge commitments about climate change and about hydrogen, particularly in a big budget, and that's good. And it'll be good to see that. And it'll give more leadership to them. And from a UK's point of view, if we can have the Americans on side, there really is a great opportunity for the UK government to take the Americans by the hand, to work with them, to make COP a success, to allow Biden to establish the leadership he needs internationally, and for the UK to demonstrate that post-Brexit, we can still lead. And I just feel that is such a fantastic opportunity for the UK government. I would be so disappointed if we don't have that opportunity. So not doomed, definitely not doomed, Bim, but harder.
Thank you for that. Lord Deben, you were quite clear that what's critical is for the UK to meet our own obligations in this country, frankly, before lecturing other people on theirs. What is your assessment of, if COP26 was today, what is your assessment of how we would be seen by others vis-a-vis our own obligations? And secondly, connected with that, Duncan Law from Community Energy England has said, he's quoted the Committee on Climate Change and quoted you as saying, it will not be possible to get close to meeting a net zero target without engaging with people by pursuing an approach that focuses only on supply side changes. People and communities must be key to energy, climate change and recovery policy. Duncan's contention is that the government has no strategy to get the consent and participation of the people, choosing mostly to focus on big technological solutions, I want to stress this is Duncan's. This is Duncan's wording. How do you think we can change this? So first of all, do you accept that? So really, first question is, what's your sense of how we would be seen today in terms of meeting our obligations? Second point is, do you think the government can change to engage with people more effectively? I know you mentioned that in your talk.
Well, today we would be seen as a leader in word, but not in deed. We would certainly be honoured for the fact that we have sought both to have an institutional structure which is in advance, I think, of any other country. Even of the 11 or 12 that have copied our system, none has given it the independence and the kind of wide-ranging position that we are given. But we would not be seen as more than that because we haven't done more than that. And so that's why this next year is so important. I think one first of all has to say that the government has shown every intention of getting this right. I'm not, I'm the independent chairman of this committee, and I am not, as everyone knows, very much in line with a very considerable amount of what the government wishes to do. This is not the kind of policies which I personally would have supported. But on climate change, I have to say, it has every intention of doing the right thing. It has done one crucial thing, which is to make it clear that this is a whole government activity and not just something that DEFRA and BEIS gets on with. And the Prime Minister has taken personal determination and leadership in that. That seems to me to be very clear, and we ought to be very clearly supportive of that. It's also true that in the short term, 1 year activities to get out of COVID, which is the way in which Rishi Sunak has sought to do these things, there's a very great deal of good green activity that we need to have. And I must say, I think the Department of Transport has been very quick to understand that one of the big steps that has to take place is for us to get rid of fossil fuel motor cars as rapidly as possible. And I think we've had good leadership there, perhaps surprisingly, because the Department of Transport has historically been one of the most difficult ones when coming to these issues. So I think that's the upside bit. The downside bit is that so far there's very little actual detailed arrangement. There's very little clear connection between the government, regional government, and local government. And there's also this sad fact that Scotland and Wales are doing better than the rest of the United Kingdom. And the government doesn't seem to see that there really is a rather good competition going here. And why not learn from somebody else some of the things that they've done well? If you look at what the Welsh have done about waste, for example, if you look about the targeting and such like of the Scots, then there's a great deal to learn from the United Kingdom. And if devolution is to mean something, it ought to give you a certain amount of competition. And for Conservatives, I'd have thought that was part of the sort of competitive attitude. So I think there is something to be said that the government hasn't got a clear, detailed, enforceable, put into law and practice program, although it has every good wish. It also, I think, has really got to learn how to work with local government and regional government, because in the end, the delivery of all this has got to be at a local level. It's going to be house by house and street by street, and therefore it's got to be with local and regional government. And Climate Change Committee is very clear that that is a crucial part of how we proceed.
Thank you, John. And yeah, I think that the difficulties with the relationship between central government and whether it be devolved assemblies and governments, or indeed local government in England is something that pervades not just climate policy, but all sorts of policy. And I do think that it's pretty urgent the government tackles it. Alison, I'm going to ask you one question, and then we'll come on to talk about devolution. We'll come on to Alan Brown from the SNP, who wants to ask a couple of questions. But just before I move on to Alan, Alison, from your research and your analysis, when we think of China, so I've done a couple of trips to China in the last couple of years, a couple of virtual ones this year. The thing I'm so struck by is how they all are singing from a very pro-environmental hymn sheet. I mean, this is the first thing they say when they're in discussions on practically anything about how important it is. What's your assessment about how seriously the Chinese are taking this, and how potentially this could be one of the ways in which, to follow on from Amber's comments around the relationship with the Americans and the sort of uncertainty about their leadership, one of the ways in which we could work with China very, very closely going forward?
Yeah, there are different sides to China's engagement. I think they're very serious about it on an international diplomacy side. I think there's definitely getting one ahead of the US. I think by making closer, working closely on climate with the EU and having Japan and South Korea fall in place in terms of the net zero targets, I think there is definitely a positioning there and a leadership. And one, if it is a Trump presidency, that the US is going to fall behind in terms of markets, in terms of access, and that China and Europe are going to become the hubs for new progressive technologies that are already out, in terms of price, much cheaper. So you've got solar and wind that are much, much cheaper, even for the US states, than the coal and in many cases gas. So there's a transition happening, and China is wanting to put itself firmly in that leadership, in that leadership space with strong allies. At a national level, there is obviously, with COVID coming in, there's actually been a rise in coal power plants being planned in China as a response to COVID. How do we keep business going? And I think there is a sort of national to local issue going on there. So I think it's how they make sure that they have a just transition internally in China, so that the people who have coal jobs now are moved into that new green, low carbon technology, and it brings the people with them. So there's national issues about how they deliver. There's also the Chinese investment around the world, in Africa, across Asia and Latin America, which doesn't always match the green credentials. And I think that's something like the Belt and Road Initiative, making sure that is pulled into those green, so that China's actually bringing the world with it. So I think it's a complex issue, but certainly on that global stage, going into COP26, also before COP, just really worth mentioning is the fourth 5-year plan is coming out next year, and I think the national level hopefully will be dealt with through the clear direction on climate change in the national 5-year plan in China next year. And I think that's a critical thing, to embed it in there, and I think really show commitment, and therefore allow them to come forward with a much stronger NDC themselves. So yeah, so a little bit complex, but I think a positive direction.
Great, thank you. Alan Brown, my colleague from the SNP. Alan, over to you.
Thanks, Bim. I wasn't actually going to talk about devolution. I thought Lord Deben did a good enough job for me. If it's okay, I've got a couple of questions. First of all, I'll ask them both at the same time, but one, I'm looking for an answer for a review from Amber. Hi Amber, obviously before you had the role as Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, obviously there's departmental shuffles to deal with Brexit and all the rest of it. But looking ahead, given that BEES as it currently stands, Alex Sharma's got to deal with, in terms of business, there's Brexit preparation still to deal with, there's a whole COVID recovery, then obviously COP26 presidency and all the work associated with that. So would it be the time to actually reform a standalone secretariat department for energy and climate change? Because it just seems to me that put a marker down how important the UK is treating that. And then if I just continue, if that's okay, and it's for Lord Deben, it's following on from what Bim said, or asked about how the UK would be viewed today rather than a year's time. and you said we'd be a leader in words, not deeds. So if the UK is to turn up at COP26 next year and improving the words and deeds by demonstrating deeds, what would be the top 3 asks you'd be looking for the UK to have put in place that can go, so when turn up next year to actually demonstrating by deeds, not just the words?
Thank you, Alan. I hope you're well. Yes, of course, I was devastated when they closed energy and climate change. I thought it was a great shame. And as it's become higher up the agenda than it was even then, I hope that the current government will reflect on that. And I worry that it's not given enough of a priority, which is why I'm calling for the COP itself to be run from the Foreign Office, which is a more senior department and reflects the need for more diplomacy. But best of all would be back to a separate Department of Energy and Climate Change. I had to tell my son that unfortunately, no, they didn't close it just because I did such a good job. It was a genuinely reshaping of government, but I wish he'd be right. Yeah, I think that was the only question for me. So yeah, I agree with you. It should be come back.
Thanks for that.
Well, if I'm to say what are the major things, the first thing the government has got to do is to make sure that we stop building crap houses which have got to be retrofitted. It's a very simple step and it has to be done. One of the permanent failings of the Conservative government was when they ditched the zero homes target. It was agreed, it should have been done, and we've built 1 million homes since then, all of which will have to be retrofitted, and it is a scandal and a great sadness. And the government needs to be able to put into operation some very clear building standards which will get our new homes built somewhere near, and I put it like that because the passive house standard is a complex one and there are easier ways of doing that, but somewhere near that. And one of the reasons for that is a perfectly good social reason. If you build houses which need a lot of heating, then what you do is to sell a house with a bill. And for every year, people have to pay for it. And I think the house builders really should look at their own hearts and say the 9 house builders who build 80% of our homes have gone on building houses they knew were much less good than they could have done and making very good returns on their investments and profits. And so that's my first priority. Second priority is that we've actually got to do something about the heating of our older homes. And that means a really positive building on what the government has already done about insulation, about the installation of heat pumps, about the movement away from the fossil fuels that we are now using. That's going to be a complicated matter, but it has 2 wonderful advantages in addition to the climate one. First of all, it's one of the very best ways of putting people back to work. This is a very good employment policy, and of course it can be aimed particularly at those parts of the country that are least well off, and that gives you the third advantage, which is that this is really something that you can do in order to have levelling up. I really feel that it's such a contribution to ordinary people who are fuel poor, because they live in homes which need that improvement. And very often this is publicly owned homes. These are council houses which need a recreation. I went to a place in Wales just to say how brilliant the Welsh had been in redoing a whole council estate. And when I talked to one of the teachers involved in the local school, I said, what is the difference since this happened? And he said to me, my children don't come to school wet and in wet clothes. The social implications of what you can do for climate change make me more determined that that should be that actually was a European Union supported thing. I don't want to get into that situation, but I hope everybody's noticed that the leadership of the world has moved in a way which is not good, either for the United States or for Britain. And in both cases, it has been self-inflicted wounds. And we'll, both of us, have to spend a lot of time making up for what we've managed to do to ourselves and how much more difficult we've made it for ourselves to do what we need to do on climate change.
Great, thank you for that, Lord Deben. I've sort of asked my questions, and Anna McMorrin, who I was going to bring in, says she's got to go to another meeting, and so I was going to bring her in, but she can't, unless Anna, you're still there?
No. Yes, hello, yeah, I'm still here.
Right,
Thanks.
Anna, so basically Anna worked for, I think you worked for the Welsh Government.
Yes, I was a special advisor in the Welsh Government on climate.
Yes.
On climate.
A master of the dark arts. On climate, though, fighting for the good fight.
Yeah, so between 2008 and 2014. So it was, I just want to say, it's good to hear Lord Deben talking about the power of devolved governments and states and regions across the world, because after I was in the Welsh Government, I left in 2014 and worked for an international organisation representing 50 states and regions across the world in the run-up to the Paris Climate Agreement. So during the Paris Climate Agreement was the first time we saw subnational governments mentioned officially in the text, in the agreed text. So that was fantastic to see. So I would say and completely agree that we need to see more cooperation, certainly within the UK, and using the great work that's being done with our devolved governments and moving that forward, learning from each other. So I think, you know, and learning from each other across the world as well, because a lot of this work is done at a very local level.
Thank you for that. I mean, if I might say something which is at risk of will make me unpopular, but I'll try and word it in a way that isn't entirely career-ending. I'll do my best. Everybody always says we need to work more with local government and devolved assemblies and governments, and everybody always says that, and everybody nods very sagely. However, the practice of this, and I know, having spoken to several of my very senior government colleagues over the last few weeks in relation to COVID, and I'm not getting into the whole COVID argument, but in practice, it seems from a Conservative government at the moment in Westminster, from a lot of people's perspective, it looks like these are centres where people seek to, for political reasons, oppose the government. And it makes it hard to work cooperatively if there isn't that trust that people are actually trying to do something positive. Now, I'm not asking you to speak for the Welsh Government. You know, you're a member of Parliament and you've got your own, you'll have your own views. But I'm interested as to whether you think that it is possible to have one party in Chole in Westminster, one in Cardiff, or whether it be Holyrood in Scotland, and to have different parties in control where you actually think they could work cooperatively together. Because frankly, in my long 3 years in Parliament, it has felt long, I haven't noticed that work very well. And I'm wondering whether we all just say this, but in practice, it's much, much harder.
You make a really, really good point. But I would say from experience and having worked within, from Copenhagen, within the Copenhagen COP onwards, that it is absolutely possible for different governments to work well together. So, of course, we had Labour in government during Copenhagen, where Ed Miliband led the charge in Copenhagen, and we saw the disastrous coming out of Copenhagen from the international world. That wasn't from a lack of absolute effort from the UK. But then we've seen subsequently some incredibly good working up until, I would agree with you, these few years. So I was within, and I would go along to these COPs working from representing Welsh Government with ministers from the Welsh Government, but working within the representatives coming from the UK and across the board, so Scotland and the UK government. So it can work very, very well. But I think the politics of these last 3 years, and dare I say, the direction of the UK government and the kind of unwillingness to engage with the devolved governments has made it very, very hard. So I think structures need to be put in place to make that a far better engagement moving forward, certainly as we move forward now to hosting next year.
Bim, can I just say something about it? Because first of all, the Climate Change Committee, of course, works with all these governments, and we have separate contracts with them. So I spend a good deal of time working with
Leslie.
In the most amicable way.
Yes,
I'm in the lucky position of having been appointed by a Liberal Democrat minister, a Scottish nationalist First Minister, a Welsh socialist, and a Protestant unionist, and they got a Catholic Conservative. But I mean, you know, the fact of the matter is that's rather helpful in independence terms. But I really do think, Bim, there is something else. It is perfectly possible. But there is an institutional problem which politicians will not face up to, and that is that civil servants do not rate the quality of local government officers in the way that they ought. They don't like the idea that people working for the Manchester government or the local government or the Liverpool local government somehow or other have the capability. And yet they not only have the capability in many cases, and some of them remarkably, and I work with them, I know how good some of them are. Some are not, but then that's true about every part of government. And I do think there's a very great need for the whole of the system to recognise that there are things which you can do locally which you can't do nationally. That's as true in the devolved government. It's very important for Wales. One of Wales's strengths has been the use it has had as a government with its local government, and the way it's worked with local government is exemplary. So it seems to me that there are some very ready people to work on climate change, and climate change should be the one thing that this government, in the Conservative interest, should be able to work with these other people in Labour or Liberal Democrat or any other nationalist interest, because it's the one thing where we do actually have a totally common view. And that's why I don't buy this. And if it isn't working, then frankly, it's the government's fault, because it can easily reach out. COVID has been entirely different because COVID has genuinely had differences of opinion about who pays for things. What we're trying to do here is who carries through the activities for which the government is committed to pay. So I don't think the issue arises.
Yeah, and to finish us, Amber Rudd.
Thank you, Bim. Well, Anna, such a good point, and good to hear about your commitment and involvement in the subject. The more expertise Parliament has to try to do the right thing, the better. I do take the point, though, that the past 3 years have seen growing divisions within the United Kingdom. And there is lots of talk about Scotland particularly and the potential loss of the Union. And so I think that the government is making a brave step having the COP in Glasgow, but it's also a direction of travel which is encouraging, which is trying to make sure that everybody works together. And we should be able to achieve that. As you know, that is also one of the successes of Paris. I remember engaging with Nicola Sturgeon, particularly when she came out to Paris. So, and as John and Lord Deben said in his final comments, we are all on the right side of this. We are all trying to achieve the same thing, which is to address dangerous climate change.
Thank you, Amber. Thank you, Lord Deben. Thank you, Alison Doig. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I found that really interesting. I hope you guys did too. And you know, I think it's going to be a very, very interesting few months on this and on other things as well. So
Thank you very much, Bim. Thank you for your leadership in this as
Yes,
well.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.